Bueno, muy buenas tardes. Gracias a todos y todas por su participación esta tarde. Rápidamente un par de palabras en español before I switch to English. Mi nombre es Angelika Rettberg, dirijo la maestría en Construcción de Paz de la Universidad de los Andes. Tengo el gusto de darle la bienvenida a Paula Gaviria, quien es asesora presidencial para Derechos Humanos y antes fue directora de la unidad para las víctimas. De hecho, creó y armó esa unidad y creo que es parte de la experiencia interesante que nos puede contribuir hoy. Rápidamente también para explicarles que este es un webinario en el sentido de que gran parte de nuestro público no está sentado en este salón, sino nos está observando por esa cámara que amablemente nos están facilitando. Nos están observando universidades en el Reino Unido y en Estados Unidos, estudiantes de pregrado de diferentes carreras interesados en la situación colombiana. Y nos estarán siguiendo por internet, por un enlace que seguramente ustedes también vieron en la invitación. Y la razón, y por eso es que haremos esto en inglés. Entonces, a continuación, cambio de idioma. So, a very warm welcome to everybody to Universidad Los Andes. It's a pleasure to have you here. Hi to everybody watching us over Ustream. It's great to have you on board. I have the great honor and pleasure to welcome among us Paula Gaviria, who is the Presidential Advisor for Human Rights and the previous director of the Victims Unit, which is one of the main Colombian institutions dealing with victims' issues in the country. What we will do this afternoon, after finalizing these welcome remarks, is to briefly go over a few of the challenges that we're facing in Colombia right now as the country really starts its journey towards long-term peace building and reconciliation. We have received all kinds of questions from many of the wonderful viewers this afternoon. But we will first start with a brief outline of issues that we'd like to address. Of course, in the meantime, you're welcome to send questions to Alex Jones, to redtree.study, who will be able to transmit those questions to us. Of course, we cannot promise to answer all the questions you may have about the Colombian situation, which is complex, which is difficult, which offers all kinds of routes of interpretation, but we'll do our best effort to try to address as much as we can. So right now, I turn it over to Paula Gaviria. Thanks again, Paula, for coming to Los Andes. It's a pleasure to have you here, and welcome everybody.
Hello to everyone, the ones that are here and the ones that are over the other part of the world. I think you told me there were people from the UK and the USA, mainly. Thank you very much. I had to write my words today because my English is not as good as Angelika's, but I hope I make myself understandable. So I'm going to share my views on the challenges that Colombia faces in terms of reconciliation, peace, and human rights, which is mainly my field of work, and I hope they are useful for you. So should I start right now?
Please.
Okay. So a basic statement is that we cannot understand our present and our future without talking about our past. So I'm going to do a little brief of context on the Colombian peace process and the current human rights policies. I'm going to talk about 4 issues mainly, and then some conclusions. First, a little bit of historic context. Colombia has constantly searched for mechanisms to achieve peace. This is a current activity that different presidents have tried to accomplish. But several peace processes have failed over the years, in part due to the international context, drug trafficking, excessive resources for arms, etc., and armed groups, but also in part of the national context. And I also think that in part because society in Colombia had not appropriated these processes really as we think we are actually doing. The armed groups still thought that they could eventually win by means of armed confrontation, and the state believed that it could defeat the guerrilla and vice versa. It was like the eternal question all the time. But we think that in the year 2010, a big difference came up when actual President Santos was sworn in as president. He said that he hadn't thrown the key of peace away. This was a big surprise because his campaign was a structure on something else. It was the first time that he talked about peace, and he did it on his speech as receiving the presidency. At that moment, nobody knew he was thinking about it. I mean, I have to accept that I wasn't even between the ones that voted for him because he offered something else. And no one knew that he was really working secretly with the FARC on what after came the negotiation with them. The Colombian state and the FARC had been at war for more than 50 years, and he thought carefully, very carefully, every step that he had to take to achieve peace. So that's the first thing. In terms of human rights, there are two very important things that happened during the first years of the presidency, the first 4 years. And I want to talk about two of them regarding the topic that I was invited to talk about. The first one is the Victims and Land Restitution Law, which was passed in the year 2011 and has a duration of 10 years. It runs up to the year 2021. And then the National Strategy for the Guarantee of Human Rights, which was formulated in the year 2014 and goes up through the year 2034, a long-term public policy on human rights. First of all, President Santos promoted the Victims Law, which was passed by Congress, as I told you, in the year 2010, and in the year 2011. Colombia committed to provide assistance and reparations for the victims, even though the war wasn't over. This is the first example in the world that a program for compensation and attention to victims is passed when the conflict is still ongoing. Even when there seemed to be no hope, we found a way to acknowledge victims, to start repairing them, and to move forward in a process that will finally and hopefully lead us to peace. 8 million Colombians are officially registered as victims. We think it's the largest register in the world. We don't know if there are more victims in other countries. What we know is that the state took the decision to be accountable for those victims. And that's like a very ethical and moral step that the Colombian government took. We strongly believe that the solution to the conflict is to assume its complexity and the damage that was suffered by 16% of our population. This government recognizes the existence of victims. This seems obvious, but a previous government didn't recognize the existence of victims or the existence of conflict, and has already compensated almost 700,000 victims. Around 300 groups and communities have begun their collective reparation process, and 300,000 people have received psychosocial care. Some consequences that we can see already from the Victims Law. First, the state is repairing and supporting the community process through compensation, restitution, and satisfaction measures, rehabilitation, and guarantees of non-repetition. We've learned that there are many agreements to be reached and that there are very different people to attend. Diversity in Colombia is a main issue and a main challenge. People begin to rebuild trust in the state, which we think was one of the main causes of a protracted conflict, the lack of trust in the state and its institutions. Rebuild trust in society also, that too often turned a blind eye to victims. Victims are sharing now their experiences, are recovering collective spaces that they had lost, and main of all, they are recovering their trust on themselves, on their communities, and in the state. Victims are empowering themselves because they participate in the public policy. When they get used to express themselves and listen to others, they don't feel alone anymore. They don't feel forgotten anymore. And they share with others sufferings that helps them come forward with their projects and with their own process. They also value democracy again and how important it is to respect everyone's rights. Somehow they recover their self-esteem and feel important and valued and part of a society and of this democracy again. The private sector plays an important role in reparations, strengthening the productive abilities of 6 million victims, which will contribute decisively to the development of the country. And thanks to the transforming reparations approach, these victims actively influence, we believe, for sure, the present and the future of Colombia. We are all involved in non-repetition of events. Comprehensive reparations not only alleviate victims' pains, but also send a strong message to society. We don't want wars. We don't want people to suffer again, never again, as we have suffered and victims have suffered in Colombia. I am honored to have been the director of the Victims Unit for 4.5 years, and to, as Angelika said, to create the Victims Unit. And I can tell you that there has been a real change in the way Colombian public opinion sees and treats victims. When we started this process in Congress, the idea and the vision that everyone had about victims was so far away from the vision that we have now. Victims were seen as a problem, as a threat, as a menace, and now they are seen as citizens, and that is something that we are very proud of have contributed to that. The second thing that I mentioned was the strategy for the guarantee of human rights, a long-term public policy until the year 2034. After long debates and consultations that brought together over 19,000 leaders from different sectors of civil society and the government, a national strategy was passed on. And this national strategy is a very ambitious strategy, and it shares a vision of the country that we believe also strengthen or is now strengthening this public policy by the final agreement reached in November. There is now a national system on human rights and international humanitarian law made up by all national institutions in the country and coordinated by our office, the Office of the Presidential Advisor for Human Rights. There are different subsystems of this national system, which I think it's important to share with you. There's a subsystem on citizenship, culture, and education based on human rights. Another one of civil and political rights. Another one of economical, social, cultural, and environmental rights. Another one about justice. Another one about equity, non-discrimination, and respect for identities. Another one about transparent public management and the fight against corruption. So even when there was no peace agreement yet, I'm talking about the year 2014 or the year 2012, Colombia was aware that human rights should be the basis for the extraordinary changes that had to come. These two elements are vital for the peace process and the final agreement, as I said, that we are now implementing. Some words about the peace process and the final agreement. In the year 2012, negotiations between the government of Colombia and the FARC were made public. As I said, there was a confident agenda, a secret agenda, 2 years prior to this. They set a specific agenda to end conflict and build peace and began the talks in Havana, Cuba. The agenda is known as the General Agreement for the Termination of the Conflict and the Construction of a Stable and Lasting Peace, which was elaborated and agreed in a previous exploratory phase, as I told you, which lasted almost 2 years in the whole. They discussed the following topics. First, the comprehensive rural reform, the political participation, the end of conflict, the solution to the problem of illicit drugs, the agreement regarding the victims, and the implementation and verification mechanisms. I would like to really highlight civil society's participation during the process. I think it was key, and it's going to continue to be key in the implementation. More than 50,000 proposals, 15,000 proposals, were sent to both parts via email and posts. 3 regional forums and a national one were held in Colombia with victims and with other civil society. 5 delegations of 12 victims went to Havana to tell their story, their testimonies. Organizations of women also traveled to Havana to have gender-based approach included in the final text of the agreement. And other organizations, as indigenous populations, for example, expressed their views in the forums and in the dialogue table. By September 2016, both parts had reached an agreement in all the 6 points of the agenda that was later rejected in the plebiscite held in the 2nd of October in the year 2016 by a very small margin of 0.5% of the votes. After that, President Santos kept on talking with all parties in order to include some of the opinions of those who voted against it. And finally, on the 24th of November, the final agreement was signed in by President Santos and the leader of the FARC, who is known as Timochenko. The whole agreement has a human rights-based approach that points to both the causes and the consequences of the conflict. Farmers' rights to access land, political participation, victims' rights to truth, justice, reparations. It also has specific points dedicated to human rights issues, such as the creation of a plan to promote human rights, or the protection of human rights leaders, and a plan to promote human rights education. Some challenges that we see. Given the entire context, I would like to refer to some 5 challenges, I think, that we have, or that we see. First, implementation in the short and long term. We have new institutions that are going to be created. Others will assume a more active role. We're going to create a truth commission. We're going to create a special unit for the search of the missing person. We're going to create a special jurisdiction for peace, amongst others. We have to guarantee the rights of victims, including children living the guerrilla. We have to put forward a comprehensive system of truth, justice, reparations, and non-repetition. In truth, for example, the guerrilla has to acknowledge its responsibility in massacres, such as the ones in Bojayá, or La Chinita, or the congressmen in Valle del Cauca, which they already have started to acknowledge. In justice, for example, sentences will vary depending on several factors, such as if the person acknowledges its responsibility. The sooner it acknowledges its responsibility, the better treatment it's going to get in the process, and its contribution, obviously, to reparations. And in reparations, people will view the victims' law and decide on the regions or groups to be prioritized. In reintegration, for example, FARC men and women are now moving and ending their movement to 26 specific areas of the country where they will hand their arms to the UN. After the day 180, they will go to the places where they intend to settle and shape their own life projects. The mining, for example, of the Colombian fields, so IDPs can go back to their land, is another main challenge. The second challenge is successful reconciliation. Among the communities, first, those who committed crimes and their victims will live together in their villages, towns, or cities. It is extremely important that both feel their rights are respected so they don't use violence anymore. Coexistence and the role of society. Urban areas were mostly far away from the armed conflict. Even if they knew what was going on, we all didn't prevent it or were indifferent to that. So we are given the opportunity to make things right again. Successful reconciliation towards the state, for example. Communities felt abandoned by the state, completely abandoned. So institutions need to be present in those areas formerly controlled by the FARC or abandoned by the state. Mental health, for example, for successful reconciliation. Around 15% of the population suffered strong forms of violence due to conflict. We made a survey, and we know that 3 million people, 3 million victims, need some type of psychosocial attention, and we have already only reached 300,000, which is a lot for our own context, but it's few for the need that people have. We need to tackle the issue, so as we all know how to tackle pain, resentment, or even hate. The third challenge is sustainability. Allocate all the resources needed to the implementation. Colombians are committed to peace and international cooperation in supporting the process already, but this is a main challenge. Presidential elections, it's a definite main challenge. They will be held in the year 2018 on May. Implementation is a long-term issue that should not be stopped when another president gets to power, but there's a challenge there. The fourth challenge is peace process with the ELN guerrilla, what we have called the complete peace. Today, as you have known, the public dialogues with the ELN leaders began in Quito. They have tried to reach areas formerly controlled by the FARC. Some regions of Colombia are controlled now by the ELN. We hope to find an agreement so there can be, as I said, a complete peace. And the fifth challenge is other forms of violence. Criminal gangs wishing to control the drug trafficking business are there, and they are a threat to the peace process. Everyday violence between families, against women, violence in schools, violence at home, violence at work is a main challenge still in Colombia. And obviously a main issue is gender-based violence. Okay, my fourth point is reasons to have hope after these challenges. An agreement for the termination of the conflict is the best way to guarantee non-repetition of the terrible victimizing events that occur in Colombia. Ending the war will help the sustainability of the public policy on victims and will pave the way to a new culture of respect for human rights. Victimization levels dropped during the dialogues in large scales. In the year 2002, we almost had 850,000 victims in the country. 850,000 victims in the country. By the year 2016, we went down to 50,000. This is a major decreasing of the victimizations. Even if one victim is too many, there is evidence that the changes are happening already. Colombians willing to build a stable and lasting peace that is based in extending our democracy, in strengthening pluralism and citizen participation is another reason for hope. Fourth, we are determined not to lose the progress we have made. Lives were saved during the bilateral and definite ceasefire. FARC should keep on releasing children to support the legitimacy of the process. Tomorrow we're going to give good news to the country, I hope, on this issue. Be very aware of it. We will continue accompanying relatives of victims of enforced disappearance and incorporate the recommendations in all the public policy. It is desirable the recognition of responsibilities more than had already occurred, and from the different parties involved, not only the FARC, also the paramilitaries, and also, obviously, the government. Fifth, human rights organizations are plural. Public policies now incorporate an approach aimed at the traditionally most vulnerable social groups approach: children, Afro-Colombian communities, indigenous peoples, disabled people, elderly, LGBTI population. We already have a human rights infrastructure. It's a solid infrastructure. It is estimated that the post-conflict period would last for at least 15 years. That is until the year 2034 approximately. Our current national strategy on human rights, as I told you, runs up to the year 2034. So that's a guarantee for the sustainability also. Reparations began already, and we are very advanced on it. As I told you, already repaired almost 700,000 victims. Around 300 groups of collective communities have begun their process and the psychosocial care that they have received. Education and culture based on human rights. It is the only way, we believe, to stop violence in the long term. The Office of the Presidential Advisor for Human Rights, which I lead, is already working in a comprehensive plan to reach children, adolescents, and university students in a human rights education policy. International support. The whole world has shown its support to Colombian peace process. Actually, last week and the weekend, we held the 16th World Summit of Nobel Prize laureates in Bogota. Each one of them told us, each one of them, in the midst of the chaos and war and fear in the world, Colombia is a light to the world. They all said that. Social and youth movements for peace. It's another important reason for hope. After the plebiscite in October 2016, thousands of university students and youth organizations marched in the streets asking for peace. They are becoming each time more active. 4 conclusions. Respect for human rights is the only way for lasting peace. We are not naive, and even if the armed conflict is over, there will be challenges, as we said. However, we also know it will be easier for us if we leave behind all the pain caused by war. The state can create conditions so that forgiveness and reconciliation someday become a reality. Here we seek to repair 16% of the population that are victims, while in other countries, they have a register for less than 1% of their population, so this is a huge task. But reconciliation and peace will only become a reality if we take into account victims, their voices, their history, their experience, their hope, and their future projects. Peace is built by everyone in daily actions, beyond what is written in the final agreement. It is necessary to continue the social mobilization for peace. And finally, it is definitely worth it to keep on working to live a better life, far away from violence and conflict. It is time for us to give our generation and the generations to come the opportunity to live in a real peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. Just before I continue, I'd like to also offer the opportunity to our audience here in Colombia to address questions to us, to make any questions. You're happy, I mean, we're happy to take questions in Spanish, and we can just translate it for our audience in the UK and United States. If I can just briefly add a few challenges perhaps to what Paula just said, just to complete the picture and make sure that everybody goes away with a complete, I guess, picture of the many challenges the country faces, despite the effective and actual and evident advantages that have already been achieved. I'd first like to speak very briefly to the issue of the demobilization of former fighters. As you know, one of the challenges in conflicts that make the transition from war to peace is, of course, tending to the needs of victims, but also to make sure that former fighters find their route into inclusion into the workforce, make the transition to political organizations and or parties if they wish to do so, find some way to be socially reintegrated, and that's a huge challenge in Colombia as well, in which I should add, first of all, or should say, first of all, the country also has a very prolonged experience. More than 55,000 fighters have demobilized at least since 2005. 20,000 or more are likely to be added to that number once the demobilization of the FARC is completed and if the process with ELN is completed as well. So we're talking about a number that is small compared to the size of the country, but which is important in terms of finding solutions to Colombian citizens who at one point in their life decided to take the route of illegal action to pursue some objective and who now need to be reabsorbed into society to find a new life that's part of our civilian challenge. So that's something I'd like to address. That's, of course, not very easy in light of many of the challenges the state still faces, despite the fact that it has developed substantial capacity. There's, of course, all kinds of challenges remaining. And also, we should note, and that's one of the biggest post-conflict challenges, I would say, the lure of the illicit economies that keep not causing so much recidivism by former fighters, than new recruitment by the same kind of youth that throughout all of our history have been providing the material fuel for sustaining this conflict. So there's one important structural challenge the country needs to deal with in order to avoid future sources of violence or the transformation of violence, which of course is one of the fears that everybody holds. You may, of course, know what the experience of Central America was in this respect. We often speak to the difference to the experience of countries like El Salvador and Guatemala, where more people died after conflict ended than during war. This, of course, I don't think is going to be the future of this country. However, it is important to take into account that those risks exist and that the demobilization and reintegration efforts need to be taken very seriously in light of and an integral way with addressing the needs of victims. And I think that's one of the huge challenges many communities in rural areas who are now part of the so-called territorial peace are trying to deal with, because they of course need to tend to the needs of victims, and that's something that, as Paula already mentioned, is something that the country has been pioneering and really stands out at the global level, but they need to do that in combination with tending to the needs of former fighters, as well as, I should add, regular communities who also face enormous challenges and who have all kinds of problems to deal with in terms of the development of their activities and their services and their way of life. So that's one huge thing. Then another one, I should also add, yes, we have huge commitments in terms of what needs to be done in order to implement the agreements with FARC or the eventual agreements with ELN, but we also have a very, very substantial development agenda in the country, which requires huge amounts of resources in order to really provide the structural bases to address some of the fundamental and historic inequalities the country has had. So there's one big need for providing the financial resources, which can come either from taxes or from international cooperation. However, we've already learned that pretty much this Colombian peace is going to be as good and as bad or as well funded or as poorly funded as we Colombians are willing to fund it, because we know that most of the resources will stem from our own income, from our own production, and that should be said. One big fear that people working in this area have at this time, I would say, is that the importance of peace will very soon shift off the public radar, which is actually quite a cause of concern. You already know that the country had a very divisive referendum in October. There is clearly a status of saturation whereby people really try to not address this issue of peace and reconciliation as much as we were doing it the years before the referendum, just because this was socially and even, socially basically, such a divisive issue that it tore families, friends, communities apart, causing people not to be concerned about something that they should be concerned. And surprisingly, if you look at the news nowadays, the issue that is really facing prominently on the radar and which has sort of supplanted peace in terms of priority is corruption, which unfortunately is, of course, an issue in the country. Colombia is not the most corrupt country in the world, of course, neither is it one of the most corrupt countries in Latin America, but of course corruption is an issue which surprisingly causes people to come together to sort of push forward this anti-corruption agenda. And peace, as I said, has somehow shifted off the radar, perhaps only for a time, but this also has an implication in terms of gathering the kind of support and constituencies further implementation of the agreements will require. If this is going to be a 15-year task, for instance, you need to make sure that there's people defending content and shape and purpose of the agreements in order to make sure that nothing is going to be left off, just left off, just not implemented. Then a final issue that I'd like to address is the issue of how Colombian people are responding to many of these challenges. According to public opinion surveys, historically, Colombians have preferred a negotiated solution and support that kind of approach. However, when it comes down to asking how they feel about specific insurgent organizations, you can see that there's still much to be learned from in terms of addressing a very cruel and brutal past that the country has had, which needs to be substantially solved, which needs to be substantially addressed in any kind of policy that tries to promote reconciliation in the country. People, I think, no longer believe that each of the fighters is just a miniature version of one of the most brutal commanders that we've had in the country. People understand the complexities of armed conflict, especially in a conflict of such long duration as ours, but still there remain many cleavages and many divisions to be overcome in order to really promote reconciliation among the Colombian people. Finally, just in regards to what begins today with the process with the last remaining group, insurgent group in the country, which is the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, also the National Liberation Army. This is a very small group that is different from FARC in as much as it focused more on issues of the extractive sector and on the property of natural resources. And the contrast there is, of course, as you know, FARC has had a much more clear peasant base, much more interested in issues of agrarian structure. So there's going to be a different kind of agenda, and also one thing that distinguishes both groups and which will, I think, make itself very visible in the coming months is the fact that the ELN seeks to have a very strong social base. For them, the agenda cannot be defined beforehand. It should be negotiated with civil society, whoever they consider civil society is. And of course, much to everybody's, I guess, distress is the fact that the president that has most clearly supported the need to solve the conflict by negotiations is due to end very soon. As was already mentioned, there's going to be elections in the coming months, and we'll have a new leader as of 2018. And the ELN, I think, very clearly understands that this is their chance to bring about the kind of agreements that they would like to envision in order to give up their arms. And this probably brings me back to the first point. I think as a country, we're still working on finding the right arguments to really make a safe and fast transition from having to defend any kind of ideas with a weapon in your hand, and to really strengthen and empower our very own democracy. And I think so in as much as peace and corruption are dominating our political radar at this point, I think in the near future, the question will be how we come back and really strengthen our democratic institutions to make sure they work, to make sure that there's enough checks and balances, separation of powers, empowered citizens, elections that really define outcomes. And in that sense, we're going to be entering the global mainstream because, as you know, from the experience of all of the countries that are represented in this audience, this is clearly one of the main issues at hand at this point. So I think I would like to leave it there. Paula, if it's okay with you and everybody else, I would like to first ask you a few questions, which I had when I was listening to you, and then turn it over to the audience. I have several questions that I've been receiving while we were talking, and that's the reason why I was checking my email, not because I was not interested, which is important to make a point. So let me first perhaps ask you about the issue of minors. I think that's one of the key issues that we're addressing at this point. You mentioned that in your talks. And this is, of course, not only a question of what happens to individuals who are part of the rank and file at this point, but has to do more with a larger question, which is, what do you do with Colombian citizens who were recruited at a very young age, who have had a very rough experience during armed conflict, and who are now facing the prospect of making the transition? What are the largest hurdles that you can identify? What kind of differential approaches should they be worked with in terms of, for instance, not treating them like an adult because they have special needs? How do you make sure that they too have a very successful social reintegration?
Okay, thank you, Angelika. For the first issue is that they are special kind of people. I mean, we have this idea that they are, since they were recruited, they suffer, which they did, but they are also human beings that have a past, that had a present in the bushes and in the armed group, and dream of a future. I mean, and they are in this part of their history, which they are adolescents, which we all remember how it was for each one of us. So there are big challenges with them. in the national and international context, they are treated and seen as victims. And the victims law in Colombia says that if they go out or if they are released of before having their 18th birth, they are treated as victims. If they go out when they are 18 and a half or 18 and 1 day, they are not seen in the Colombian public policy, the victims law, as victims. I mean, they don't receive the benefits that the other victims will receive. So I really encourage, and I've said this to the FARC, and I've said it everywhere, don't tell these boys and girls that they could wait until they grow up in the guerrilla because they are going to lose some benefits. That's like the practical issue. But in real, I mean, they're seen as victims. Maybe they could be part of a crime, maybe, or they see or saw someone else committed a crime, but the main treatment towards them is them as victims. And every single minor that's in the armed group, even though they could voluntarily go to the group, they are seen as a forced recruitment. And that's not easy to see, because even them, when they go out, they don't feel themselves as victims. Because they said, in the group, I had my family. And some of them do, literally. Some of them have their uncle, some of them have their father, you know. But others build a family in the armed group, and that's a different thing that we don't see all the time. So we've seen that there's these poor kids, you know, but there are relationships with that group that they build. There are abilities that they gain in the groups that you have to take into account. It's not that you come back to civil society and to civilization, I mean, and to the legality, and then you do what we think is best for you. The state has to adapt its programs and its response to what these kids are now, you know, and they are a history of a process, sometimes of violence that took them to go to the bushes, a context where their family, there was internal violence or sexual violence or whatever, or very critical conditions, economical conditions, or some were taken really in the strong sense by force. So it's a big challenge. We are on it. What we are going to announce tomorrow is well, some good news that I can tell you right now, but we're also going to announce the approval of a special program for them that I am going to have the honor of leading. The honor and a big challenge of leading. So what we need to do is really turn all the state response and adapt the state response to the needs of these kids, their dreams, their possibilities, their abilities, and obviously, and the most important one, is the approach of prevention of future use or use of these kids, because there's a big risk that this is seen, their work is seen as how do you say that, a cheap mano de obra, a workforce. I mean, they are seen as that, and they know how to do certain things that are going to be very attractive for this new crime and back crimes and all that. So the prevention is going to have to be a big emphasis in this aspect, and prevention is a strong state. Prevention is education, prevention is opportunities, and also prevention is security.
This is a question that is sent to us by Alba at Newcastle University. She says the following: can you talk about how the processes of reconciliation and peace building will be approached in cities and urban contexts? People talk about cities as places of indifference and hostility, where those who flee violence in the countryside are often re-victimized in urban contexts, for example, through the difficulties of accessing support, the stigma associated with being a victim, or even the continuing presence of paramilitary groups or bandas criminales in marginalized neighborhoods. On the other hand, you have people in urban areas who haven't directly experienced violence related to the armed conflict and are more concerned that post-conflict and its demobilization processes will lead to an increase in street crime. Is it important to reach out to them? What are the difficulties in bursting the urban bubble, as it were? May I just add just a very brief thing, which is there a difference between being a victim in urban areas than in rural areas?
Okay. 50% of the IDPs are concentrated in 13 capital cities. So there's a big challenge in these cities. What we began doing in the victims unit was, I don't know how you say in English, the principle of co-responsibility between the private sector, the state at the national level, and the state at the local level. So what we, and there's still a public policy now, how to tackle the vulnerability of IDPs. Is not only compensating them, is not only restituting back their lands or whatever, but families want to stay in the cities, and you need to help them overcome their vulnerability. And that's a big responsibility of the state. We have 64% of the IDPs in Colombia that live under the line of poverty. So there's a big challenge regarding income for victims, for example, job for victims. I know Angelika already talked about the reintegration. People are going to be reintegrated, but the proportion between, I don't know, a city like Bogota, which has now active victims, I mean that they are in the register and that you can find them. It's about 300,000 that you can contact them, that you know where they are. How many people are going to reintegrate to Bogota? I mean, the challenge to really reintegrate also victims to cities is huge, and it's going to take us a long time. That's one thing. The other thing I find very important is the one regarding education. I already talked about that. Being far away from conflict, I think it's a big reason for, or explains a little bit the indifference, and also the stigma, and also this lack of solidarity to victims and people that are in process of reintegration. So we really think that this has to be a very strong policy on education, on human rights, and on reconciliation in schools, in other community spaces, in family level. The work that the media have to do is huge, huge work with local media. And we are now developing a program which we called Humanizando, which is called, translated to humanizing, because what we really think is that we have to humanize the others. We have to humanize the victim, we have to humanize the one that is demobilizing. And finally, we have to humanize everyone else, which where violence was finally naturalized in our way of seeing the world and of relating to each other. So education for us is a main thing a main instrument to work on this process in the cities. And also I've seen an important movement of awareness. I think that we have, I mean, with what happened after the plebiscite, I think that the cities started to wake up a little bit, and I trust and I have a lot of confidence in the youth and in the universities, everything that you can do to keep the reflections and to think about how to tackle all these needs that are there is going to be key.
Okay, so I'm going to take this question by Jack Hirsch at the University of Leeds. He's asking us whether we think the drug trade in Colombia has had the biggest impact on democratic institutions, or have other issues, such as a lack of post-colonial preparation, been responsible for barriers to liberalism. I wouldn't know about the second part of the question, but I would like to speak to the issue of the drug trade in Colombia, because in fact, if you look at key drivers of war in the country, it's difficult not to think of two at least, which is, first of all, the issue of land, who owns it, how it is used, how it is integrated or not via a national infrastructure into national processes of state building, of economy building as well. And the second issue, at least since the 1980s, perhaps before, has in fact been the drug trade. If you look at the regions where conflict was most intense, where conflict intensity was highest over the years, over the decade of the 90s and 2000s, you will see there's always a coincidence between illicit crops and presence of armed actors. You can say the same thing about mining, and that brings me to the question of someone else asked a question about mining, and I can't find him right now, but someone else sent a question about mining. That's also, of course, the kind of illicit economy that provides the fuel for organizations with an insurgent agenda to flourish. This, of course, does not mean, and this should be said very clearly, that any of these insurgent organizations can be reduced to just mafia-style kind of organizations. If they were that, they would not bother in teaching Marxism, Leninism at least once a week, at least when they were active. And we can certainly see that at this point with the ELN, the other group that's starting negotiations today, which has a very sophisticated, historically grounded ideological agenda. But on the other hand, it is true that the drug trade provided the kind of financial oxygen these groups required once the Cold War was over and other sources of possible international funding were gone. Having said that, the fact that illicit crops were included in the agreement, of course, speaks to the fact that this was an issue that both sides have always admitted and agreed to address with mutual efforts to combat illicit crops. But to expect the problem of the drug trade to end with a peace agreement with FARC is too much optimism at once. This does not depend on Colombia alone. This is a systemic problem which depends, of course, on producing countries, and I speak in plural, as well as on consumer countries. So if, for instance, the issue of the drug trade and its impact on democracy at the global level is of interest to the person asking this question, it would be nice to also think about this in terms of domestic policy in countries like the US or the UK. I don't know if you'd like to add something to that, Paula.
Just a little bit. The approach to this topic in the agreement is, and both parties committed to this, is to find a definite solution to the problem of illicit drugs. And it includes a new vision that gives a different and differentiated treatment to the phenomenon of consumption, which I think is very important, and that the President Santos is starting to move this issue in the world discussion. Also to the organized crime associated with drug trafficking, and for us is very important, the approach that it was given to this issue, which is a human rights and health based approach, which I think is going to change the vision that it's not going to be so soon, but it's going to hopefully change the vision that we have towards this issue in Colombia.
I'm open to your questions. Just raise your hand when you're done. Otherwise, I'll just keep reading those of our colleagues in other universities. This is from Jessica Loiser at the University of Ottawa in Canada. Hi, Jessica. And she asks, many Colombian victims of the conflict have migrated to Canada as refugees or immigrants. As we are all aware, the different political and ideological allegiances, along with the distinct level of education, urban or rural origin, economic status, and social class, create obvious segregation and conflict within the resettled Colombian populations. Now that the country is moving forward with reconciliation and peace building, how could this affect the Colombians that are living abroad and their relationship? I think this is an interesting question because it asks about the whole issue of the diaspora, what all the victims that have left the country, what will happen to them?
Okay, when I was at the victims unit, we started to have information and register victims abroad. The register now has more than 10,000 people that have registered abroad towards the consulates. In Canada, in concrete, we have 1,015 people that are registered as victims in Canada, Colombian victims in Canada. This is the first register in the world that has included victims abroad. It was a big challenge for us to start doing this because if in Colombia there's lack of confidence in the state and trust, abroad is huge. I mean, people that had to go, the diaspora and others, were really triple affected in a way. The victimization of leaving the country after a victimization in the country is huge. And it's the suffering, it's unimaginable. I mean, I've talked to many victims in Europe, in the States, and it really affected me. So it's a big challenge because there's also difficulties because people abroad, victims abroad, the ones that have asylum and international protection, were scared about being part of the victims unit, doing the declarations because they thought they were going to lose the protection of the other states. So we had to do a lot of pedagogic and all that and tell them that they're not going to lose the protection and everything. But it's not an easy thing to convince people that are outside. The government of Colombia has already compensated more than 1,000 of these victims abroad. There's a big challenge regarding, for example, psychosocial attention, because the state in Colombia cannot bring that abroad. So we try to support ourselves in the consulates, but they don't have enough infrastructure for that. So we're trying to do some work with the universities or with local authorities, but that's a big challenge. I mean, there's something there still to be done with this. And we commemorate the 9th of April, which is the National Solidarity Date. So we started like 3 years ago to do it outside Colombia. And this gave Colombians abroad big hope about us really taking them into account. They talked to me and they said, I am really important for the Colombian state. I thought they had forgotten about me. So this is a huge thing that we have to do to include them in the building, the peace building that we have ahead.
I think this is going to be our next, or almost last question. This is Lisa Sexton from North Carolina State University. She asks a question that I think is absolutely critical. I'd love to know your response, and I'd like to add something as well. The question is, I'm interested in knowing how peace-building efforts will be evaluated, especially quantitatively. How will you determine whether reconciliation efforts are successful? And I think that's one of the fundamental questions in peace building generally. Are we building peace? How will we be able to say yes or no?
Yeah, and I think that you and I have been involved in that in the past. We are we take very seriously evaluations, and I think that's something that we have to do very seriously here. I think that the state has to be much more transparent now, very held accountable a lot in, for example, the resources that are going to be invested in post-conflict. That has to be in front of everyone. Everyone has to be there watching and doing vedurías and seeing what this is going to be invested in. We cannot have corruption in the post-conflict scenario, or at least in the resources that are going to come. And I mean, this is the big hope for communities, and we cannot permit ourselves to have that. So there's a huge responsibility there. And since it's a long-term process, so we really think that it's important to plan actions, to have a baseline first. Where are we now? Where are and we think that from the human rights approach and indicators, it's a very useful tool, because people are now in a certain moment of their rights, and we really need to know if the implementation of the agreement is going to impact their lives. I mean, peace for communities in Colombia, for them, it's translated into more state. I mean, more state offer response. So we really need to value and evaluate if there's going to be an improvement in their quality of life and of their rights. So we're working on that. To the person that asked the question, from my office, we're working on that. We are taking the agreements and we're seeing how we're going to measure human rights in the implementation of the agreements, which I think is going to be very important. But we have other issues. We have a special commission that was created in the agreement. It's a commission to the follow-up of the agreements that has already been installed, and we are going to, as civil society, have to be very aware of if they're really taking the time to watch over the implementation. And there are other tools, for example, what we worked on, Angelika, some time ago, the index for conditions of reconciliation. There are tools. There are tools that I think that we have to put forward because we really have to take the time to measure and to evaluate and to be accountable for the moment that we are going to or that we are already passing by.
Just to briefly add, as a university professor, of course, my focus is more on research, and I would just like to add that there are projects that are ongoing in terms of providing the kind of monitoring and verification that is based on the agreement as well, but that also uses comparative data from other countries in order to make sure that whatever progress there is in Colombia, we are able to identify it. And also something very important, which is to be very, I guess, pragmatic about how much can actually be implemented in any kind of place in the world. Peace agreements tend to be submitted to some form of renegotiation in the aftermath of signature. Then Colombia would not be the only case in which we would find that there are some aspects that move faster and others that will be slower to make progress. And that doesn't mean that peace is not somehow being built at an aggregate level, but we need to know about that in order to not cause any unnecessary frustrations. Also, just to add, the Kroc Institute, which is an institute that's seated in the US, was specifically in charge, appointed to do this verification scheme, taking the agreement step by step in order to really follow up on each of the issues to make sure that implementation is followed up on. However, I just like to reiterate, we should not feel that the fact that not everything is implemented once and right away is a sign of failure. The peace as war is not an integral process. It is a multi-layered process. It takes some steps faster than others. There's always a step back as well. And we really need to face this with a long-term perspective to make sure that when we talk about this issue 20 years from now, we do feel that the state has been strengthened, that peace has been built, and that we're all better off, hopefully.
I forgot to say that I think that the most important issue here is ownership. We really need to own the agreement. If we don't know what it is about, obviously its challenges, its difficulties, we are not going to be able to evaluate and to know if it has reached its goals. So I think there's a big challenge there in ownership. The whole Colombian community has to own the agreement and be very aware of every single path that it has to take for its correct implementation.
Para la transmisión, para que todos escuchamos la pregunta.
So that's just like this. Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you. So I was just wondering if you could maybe, because I'm learning about the Colombian context as well, just say a little bit more of what do you really mean by reconciliation? What is the vision for reconciliation? And I guess I'm coming from my background in South Africa, where reconciliation, I think, was really a thick the vision was for a really thick reconciliation. And there was a lot of discussion on the issue of forgiveness. And I haven't heard that a lot here. I think it was briefly mentioned. So I'm just wondering, yeah, if you could speak a bit more about that, and what does reconciliation look like in the Colombian context then? I know you've said a lot already in terms of the peace building and things, but it also raises the question of what does it mean for national unity? And is there a need for a national identity like we had in South Africa through the Rainbow Nation? That's a complete disaster now, but at the time, it really inspired a lot of hope and buy-in into the peace process. Thanks.
In the state, we part from a premise, which is that the state cannot impose reconciliation, but it can give the conditions for reconciliation to happen. And conditions deal with having a good process of a DDR process, having a good process for the attention and compensation of victims, but also having a stronger democracy with the mechanisms and the spaces for participation, effective participation, but also recognizing the differences that each context in Colombia has. Colombia is so diverse in geography, but so diverse in its people, its way of organizing, etc. So that's like a premise that we have. And there's a big issue about forgiveness, for example, that the state cannot impose forgiveness, but we think that there's a need to humanize, as I was saying before. I mean, to really try to take out that's part of our DNA, which is violence in a way. So there's an effort from the state that can be done regarding a culture of peace and reconciliation, which I think it's not imposing reconciliation, it's an obligation that the state has, and we need it. Angelika.
Very briefly, reconciliation means so many things to different people, and the way we've defined it is rebuilding social relations that have been destroyed by war. And this, of course, goes beyond just repairing relations between victims and their perpetrators. It goes beyond repairing the relations between victim communities and regular communities. It really goes to some of what you said in terms of telling a different story about the history of the country and how it shaped, it came into shape throughout the years. So for instance, national memory efforts are important. However, it is not what people most expect and demand in Colombia. What they expect most and demand is physical reparations. They need to address very concrete, objective problems that they face in their daily lives, but that doesn't mean that other efforts in terms of, for instance, memory building are not important. The way we teach our national history, I think, is fundamental. Students in our very regular schools still tend to not talk nor learn about the story and the history of the Colombian armed conflict, and that has everything to do with the need to keep some things silent, and I think just be able to speak about what has happened in the country, how different sides have been involved, have suffered as well, is part of the reconciliation story. Having said that, I think forgiveness can, of course, not be imposed on anyone. It's certainly not required in order to be able to live together peacefully, which should be our aim in the future. So I just leave it there and end with a final question that is addressed to us by, is addressed to us by Eric Helliwell at Kennesaw State University, who asks the kind of question we'd love to hear, because it's a forward-looking question. And he would like to know whether there are specific activities we can do as volunteers, either outside Colombia or inside, to assist in the peace effort. And I think this is a very nice example of what you just said, Paula, in terms of owning this process. Peace is not going to be only about strengthening our national institutions. It is, of course, also about our ability to feel responsible for the future and shape and fate of the country, and be it by volunteer work or by paid work, but we really need to do, as we say in Colombia, ponernos la camiseta, just wearing the shirt, in order to make some of these, I would say, perhaps it's an exaggeration, but I really feel it's a collective dream come true.
I often say that what happened to 8 million victims happened to all of us. And I really believe that. It's not that I feel I am a victim, but I think it happened to us as a society. And we were there and we didn't know it was happening, or we turned the other way. So I do think we have a social responsibility with our present and our future. And we are convinced that it has to do with our daily life. I mean, there are things to change in our daily life, not only go and work as a volunteer, which I think it's also very valuable and needed, but also there are changes that have to be done at home, in the at work.
So as I was saying, thank you all very much. to our audience here at Universidad Los Andes, as well as people who came from other places in Bogotá. Thank you so much, Paula Gaviria, for dedicating time to us. We really look forward to your announcement tomorrow. We know you have a huge amount of work, but we're happy you're doing it. You've given us great examples. So thank you, everybody, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye. ¿Estamos en línea? ¿Estamos ampliando? ¿Ya? ¿Ya se acabó? ¿Sí? Okay, ya. Muchas gracias a todos. Y solamente advierto y aviso que estamos en inscripciones en la maestría en construcción de paz, entonces si hay alguien interesado en pasar papeles, este es el momento. Muchas gracias.